This is Nicholas Glover of the Tampa Bay Chamber. I want to thank and welcome our viewers tuning in to our 2023 candidate interview series for the City of Tampa's City Council elections. The Chamber focuses on policy, not politics. And while we do not endorse, we do want to make sure that our members and the business community are informed on where these candidates stand on the issues most important to them. We are excited to have Rick Fifer running for City Council District 6 with us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Rick.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Rick, we're just under 60 days from Election Day, and now that we are in this final stretch, can you give us a brief update, 30 seconds or so, about the campaign, as well as what message you hope to deliver to voters?
Well, I think it's going well so far. I have really focused a lot on walking precincts, so I've gotten to see things up close. The message that I really am trying to drive home is almost everything that I'm saying is the fact that we need to reprioritize what we are doing. Sometimes I put that in terms that sound real estate related. Sometimes I put that in ways that, gets people to chuckle. But I'm trying to drive home that, some of the things that are impacting the district that I'm running for are things that I think we could solve maybe over time with some reprioritization, not that they can be solved overnight. And I've had some questions where I had to tell people, I said, I can't promise you to do something I can't do, because the one thing I don't like to do is feel like I'm lying to people.
So let's talk about leadership. You obviously ran for City Council for a reason. You and the other candidates did as well. What is the role of Tampa City Council as you see it? And do you envision that role evolving during the course of your term?
Well, I think what I see the role of City Council, and I've taken some time to actually read the charter. One of the things that I do whenever I've gotten involved with an organization is I want to know where the boundaries are, what the fence posts of the position I'm seeking. And as I've looked at that, it's very clear that budget, approving contracts, those things are council's bailiwick to act on, as well as obviously issues with ordinances and stuff like that. I believe that we need to probably have a council that takes and pays greater attention to that than what's happened. And I think that right now we see some efforts to find a new balance between the role that the charter gives the mayor and the role that the charter gives City Council.
You mentioned the budget. Let's dive a little deeper into that. Obviously, approving the city's budget is one of the biggest responsibilities of City Council. And some budget experts and economic analysts, even though they are saying that inflation is smoothing a little bit, they are anticipating potentially a slowdown in the future during your term. How should the city prioritize spending during that time of uncertainty?
Well, I think what I would like to do if I'm elected to council is I would like to look a lot more closely at the budget than it's kind of hard to say as a member of the community looking at the budget that's released. You don't necessarily see the details of where it's coming from. I know there are things that are going to be impacting. If there's a bit of a slowdown in the economy, obviously that means there's going to be a slowdown to the revenue coming in. I know that as the pandemic funds fade away, that's going to require some adjustment. A lot of municipalities have had a lot of extra dollars to work with because of that. There's also potential changes that might come out of the legislature if the legislature does choose to, for instance, eliminate the local commercial sales tax. Those things are going to impact the budget. But what I would like to see in that budget is, where is there money that is maybe not being used for the best impact? I tend to be a cheap person. I try to squeeze a dime out of a nickel a lot. So, I'm going to be wanting to see how can we get the greatest impact with whatever the budget, revenues show for next year and going forward.
Let's talk about housing. The Chamber is a major proponent of workforce housing, and we define workforce housing as that missing middle between 80 and 120% of area median income. What zoning or policy or coding updates would you support to address the growing workforce housing needs in Tampa?
Well, I started out being involved in neighborhoods, and one of the things that's changed with me on this especially as we're looking at what's happening right now in terms of attainable housing. I heard somebody use that phrase as opposed to affordable before, and I actually really like that. Right now, with what I see as a realtor and real estate prices in the city, it's pretty hard for somebody that's making the median income in the city to actually buy a house. I realize that the greatest expense when it comes to building new housing is the dirt costs, what that lot costs. We as a city, as a minimum lot size, 5,000 square feet is pretty rich compared to what exists in most cities we're building on. So maybe we need to reevaluate that. I know that when I first brought this up, I was talking to a housing advocate, and he said, well, what you're proposing, they just did in Houston. And part of that was reducing the minimum lot building size. If you look at Tampa historically, those numbers were reduced historically in what you see in Ybor City and in parts of West Tampa, where you didn't have 5,000 square foot lots. The other thing that I think is happening right now that's driving up the price of houses is not everybody wants a large house, but that's what's available on the market. I've had a lot of customers over the years that want something small. They want to be in a certain area, but they want something smaller. But what their choices are sometimes mean they buy a lot more than what they really wanted or needed. So I think there's a market for that. But if you're cutting the dirt prices, you're also going to affect how large of a home is built there, which means the materials and supplies that go into it, which means after a house is done, what that builder has to sell for to actually make a profit should help create something that fills in that middle, that portion of people that are being priced out of the market right now. And at the same time, it'll make home ownership an issue. And I'm not saying that just as a realtor. I really do believe, because my growing up was not an advantage growing up. My parents never owned. And I know that within the Black and brown communities, generational wealth is a problem. I would rather find a way to have housing that they can buy, okay, to own and start building family wealth, than to be tenants someplace, because that's going to give them the resources to send their children to a trade school or a college. They're not going to have, hey, I got to scrape up the money for rent. I can borrow a little bit out of what I own so that I can help my kid achieve this. So to me, I'm wanting to look at the bigger picture. I don't want to just put Band-Aids on things. I would like to see something that solves what is really, I think everybody would say, is a problem that we have, not just here, but all over the place.
Thank you for that, Rick. Let's switch gears and talk about home rule. Local governments across the state have been critical of the legislature in recent years. Do you agree that preemption has become a problem in Tallahassee? And if yes, what would you do to establish a more productive working relationship with the legislature?
Well, I do think the tendency to preempt has become a problem. It's become a problem, for Tampa. Trees are an important part to Tampa. I wouldn't get any votes if I told people I was against trees. And yet, our tree ordinance, which was very good, you can see the difference when you fly into the airport between looking at Pinellas County versus Hillsborough. That got preempted. Now, I know there's been some changes to that, and that's a good thing. They recently, a couple of years ago, they preempted, you can't put design standards on single and two family houses. I saw that when there was discussion by one of the council members for the city to get away from using fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure. All it was a resolution, and immediately it was met with a piece of legislation introduced in Tallahassee to basically prohibit local governments from doing that. I saw that when Key West was concerned environmentally over the mangroves, they wanted to reduce the size of cruise ships. Immediately it got met with a preemption bill. There seems to be an effort, there's going to be an effort made to preempt any discussions about any type of rental rent cap increases or rent control, whichever term somebody wants to use, preempting it so that it doesn't come up again at all. The challenge at this point is we need the lobbyists, not just from Tampa, but other communities, to actually work together to say, this is really not in the best interest. First off, you're shutting down innovation. If you want to innovate in the cities, and let's see what works here, what works there. If it's working in this city, then yeah, let's travel it across down the I-4 from Orlando to Tampa, or vice versa, or take it down to Miami or borrow from Miami. But if you're shutting down through preempting home rule, you're really shutting down those experiments that might help us actually function much better, not just in our local community, but statewide.
Thank you, Rick. The next question is about economic development. Utilization of public-private partnerships continue to be an asset for local governments across the country. What opportunities for P3s do you see in Tampa?
Well, especially after the failed referendum for the transit tax, the penny sales tax increase, we're in a real box for coming up with options. And I saw that a couple of years ago, there was discussion, for instance, of a public-private partnership that would take a trolley line from downtown Tampa to West Shore, connecting the two business centers of the city. That takes some of the traffic off the road. It helps people get around a little bit better. There have been discussions about extending the trolley line. There's not the money, but the city may be partnering, because the old trolley lines that existed in this city after World War II, before they were shut down, those weren't city owned. They were actually, a working arrangement and partnership between the public sector and the private sector. So I think there's ways to do what we can't get the bond money for, because we don't have a pot of money to draw on and say, here's how we're going to cover that. I see that as virtually an essential thing, at least to help downtown. We've added all these great amenities, but we're gridlocked if they're all being utilized at the same time. So whatever partnerships we can have, to me, I think transportation is probably the most critical place to try to develop those types of partnerships.
Sticking with the idea of transportation, uncertainty persists with the already collected all for transportation referendum dollars. As you may know, the fate of those dollars rests in the hands of the Florida legislature. Assuming that Hillsborough is able to secure the funds this legislative session, what are the most important transportation investments that you'd like to see?
Well, I understand that a lot of times people beat up on a Heartline, but Heartline is what we have for public transit. And we need to make sure that we've done enough there to make sure that we're not having further shrinkage of routes and communities being served. But beyond that, as we become more dense and congested as a city, I think everybody says traffic is a lot worse. Within the city, I would really like to see something that gives the community the opportunity to meet some of the needs of deferred sidewalks, to meet some of the issues with safe crosswalks. Because one of the things that I have seen as I've been walking around and walking precincts is trying to cross some of our major arterial roads just to get to the business on the other side of the street. There's not really a safe way to do that when you've got a half mile between traffic lights and the business you want is right across the street. So safer crosswalks, I'd like to see us do some of those things, because those are going to make a difference just to enable people to get someplace without necessarily always having to get in a car while we're trying to build out the other stuff. So that's where I'd like to see it, probably towards what we have for transit, and then some of that pedestrian infrastructure that we need that unfortunately has been deferred in many cases for years and decades.
We've touched on several important topics today. And before we wrap up, Rick, is there a priority that we haven't discussed that you'd like to talk about, or something you want to circle back to reemphasize?
Well, one of the things that you didn't ask, but I do think it affects the desirability of Tampa going forward, and that is really the discussion over the wastewater treatment, what some people have referred to as toilet to tap. There are obviously ways that you can do that and do that safely. What I understand is being pursued right now is really not, because reverse osmosis would be the way to most filter the concerning thing about the chemicals and the drugs that we're prescribed and excrete being in our drinking water. You can do that by reverse osmosis, tripped over that. And I understand that the desalination plant that Tampa Bay Water operates can accomplish the same effect. But that's not what we're looking at doing. And before we start making that what people are having as part of their drinking water, we need to do that. If that were to get out, that basically to live in the city, your water is going to be this and it doesn't have the same quality and some of this stuff isn't tested, I could see that making the city a less desirable location. We don't need to do this. We don't have a water shortage. And I think that Tampa probably needs to also be much more in sync with the efforts of Tampa Bay Water.
Thank you. Where can voters go to learn more about your campaign, Rick, or your positions, or the things that are the most important to them?
You can visit my website, which is rickfifer.com, and let me spell my last name. It's Fifer. And I say that because it's an old German spelling and everybody wants to put a P in it or put a PH there. So it's rickfifer.com.
Rick Fifer, running for City Council District 6. Thank you so much for being with us, sir. On behalf of our members and our board of directors, we want to thank you for joining us today and for your willingness to serve in an elected office. That concludes our interview.
Thank you.